How about you?
I'm good. So today is politics.
Yeah, let's get into some
Okay.
politics.
So what do you got for song title?
Well, the obvious would be revolution. It's the first one that comes to mind from the Beatles. Um, there's others from solo that are interesting, but you got any others from Beatles?
Well, from the Beatles, I mean, yeah, they weren't a band that were sort of overtly political. So I think Revolution is the easy one. And probably the one that would be hard to beat.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a sense, "Love Is All You Need" is it's not overtly political, but that's seemed to be their main message.
Yeah, I mean, I really until Lennon left the band and then became obviously extremely political, it would be very hard. And then Paul never, other than maybe give Ireland back to the Irish, was not that outspoken. That never seemed to be that important to him. So and hasn't been for his entire career. He sort of stayed away from it.
Well, there's an exception to that. You want to get into that now?
Sure. I mean, we could go in any order you want.
So, well, he did become an advocate for vegetarianism and still is quite into that. So that there's a political element to that. Later in his career, also, I want to say 92, Off the Ground came out. That was the album after Flowers in the Dirt. He came out with the song, it was like a B-side called Big Boys Biggering. And it was kind of him lamenting the leaders of the world, so to speak. Just he he has a line in there called "fucking it up for everyone," and it's kind of a simplistic take, but still I get what he's saying. And
So I'm gonna embarrass myself and damage my credibility as a fan and as a co-host. He has an album called Off the Ground. I don't even think I know that record. On the
yeah,
Ground.
get with it, man. Yeah, Off the Ground. It came out right after Flowers in the Dirt.
Is there any notable song from that record?
The single was Hope of Deliverance.
Oh yeah, I know that song.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very nice song. Um, yeah, there wasn't like a big hit from it though. But he did his second world tour on the heels of that. And on that tour, he got really political. Like he was hooked up with this organization called Friends of the Earth, which is an environmental advocacy. And he was also hooked up with PETA, I believe. And before he came on, they did a video montage of all kinds of like sort of terrible things happening in the world, like animal research and environmental issues, and I mean he and Linda were taking it to us, pretty directly there. So that is interesting. So in that sense, I think his political views honed for him as he got older, and I think Linda influenced him a lot too.
So first, I'm going to challenge you, and then I have a funny story. So I think Paul has been an abject coward about politics, contemplating where his stance is in the world. I think he has just really always been afraid to offend, and it's one of the things I like the least about him. But I will tell you a funny story, unless you want to respond to that, because my story is a lighter thing, and I'm throwing this grenade at you about Paul. So
All right, well, yeah, let me think about that.
now, having said that, I think John went overboard.
Yeah.
So I'm not, like I never really like, so I'm going to contradict myself. I don't have a need to have my politics in my music. I don't need that.
Yeah, no, I bet.
But I will say that artists like Springsteen and Bono and people like that have spoken up. And
No, and I get what you're saying. And like, and if you go back to the time of late 60s, early 70s, obviously, you know, with the Vietnam War and racial tensions and you know, the Cold War and all of that. I mean, yeah, he did seem to be a little bit on the quiet side. And you know,
I'll
like,
go back to 2016 United States. I mean, like he, you know, we don't have to get into our politics, but he never sort of denounced Trump. He never really takes a stand is my issue with Paul McCartney, as I want to be fair to him, as kind of a cultural phenomenon, as a famous human being.
well,
Having said that, though, okay, go ahead.
because I got the deep details for you. So there were interviews actually where he was critical of what was happening in that period. And on Egypt Station, there's a song, what's the name of that? Despite Repeated Warnings, that he said is written about a Trump-like figure. And it's this multi-part song where he, you know, he imagines this captain of a ship kind of.
I know it, and
yeah.
I agree with you. No, I agree with you on that point.
So you know, that was
Yes.
his way of saying something.
Okay, so I'm going to stand down a little bit from that statement, but just a little bit. But here's my funny story. So when we did the Super Bowl with him, after the meeting with him, we were in London, myself and the producer of the show, and we went to some very nice club in London, like it was a private club, to have a dinner, to have fellowship. You know, we had some of our people there, in addition to the producer who we had hired, but couldn't go to the meeting with Paul because Paul wanted to keep the numbers of the meeting small. So we brought in some people, and they brought in some people, and we started to talk about, you know, the engagement and what would Paul want. And somebody said, nothing with a heart, no food with a heart. And we didn't quite know at first what they were talking about. And then they made it clear it was dietary restrictions, because Paul was a strict vegetarian. And then one of them, in their English accent, said, but there's artichoke hearts. And so there was the crew, Paul's guys, were momentarily stymied of how to quickly express what the line of demarcation was as it related to animal products. And somebody said something about a leather couch, you know, Paul doesn't want a leather couch or whatever. And then one of them, and it was almost Monty Python-esque. They were trying to figure out like ways to say it. And one of them just said, no food with a face. And somebody was like, oh yes, no food with a face. So that became this sort of thing, no food with a face.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that because he started saying that, became his public thing that he said. So I don't know if it originated there or whatever, but
yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I will say this. I mean, as somebody who fails to keep a strict vegetarian diet, but really wishes I could, his activity, his activism, his outspokenness about animal rights, I think is extraordinarily commendable. And I really respect that about him. So
yeah, I agree. And I can remember going to that show that I was telling you about in the early 90s. And I was really touched by his presentation, and I've never been moved to make that plunge in that lifestyle, but I do respect it also. And you know, I like that it's coming from compassion, you know, as much as anything. And I see his point. Now, in terms of the origin of their story, I think some of that gets mythologized, because like I just saw a video recently where they were promoting London Town. This must have been like 78, and they were kind of walking around London, and sure enough, Linda, she's got fish and chips, so I think this was a little bit of a gradual waking up for them. And I don't know when they actually made the plunge to go all the way, and then after that, I have seen interviews where, or at least one where he was challenged on, well, aren't you wearing a leather belt there, Paul? And aren't your shoes leather? And he kind of just brushed that off. But maybe by the time he got to you, it was like, he didn't want it anywhere around him. I don't know. And the last thing I'll say about that is, again, I mean, I can't say I've rigorously studied it, but I have a worry, if nothing else, that PETA's quite extreme. I don't know. I sometimes wonder if they'd rather have the animals take over than than humans. But anyway, that aside, I'm with you. I commend his sincerity, and he's he's never given up on that. So now, as we transition to John, let's not forget Paul's "Too Many People" song, which I know you're well familiar with, and so that's 1971, and that's him taking a shot at John and Yoko for being too vocal about what they stand for, and maybe some of their going in bags and bed-ins and stuff. He saw all that as self-aggrandizing to some extent. What do you think?
Well, it's funny. I never knew that until I just read the Kosnin book. What was interesting about that, and I know that that's not today's episode, is I always thought John fired the first shots, but it was actually Paul that fired the first shot, right? Because too many people preceded "How Do You Sleep." I think that John Lennon in the early 70s, with the influence of Yoko Ono, was determined to be, as I think they've described it, the world's clowns, and to try and put some silliness as a wrapper around the injustices and the indecencies that were taking place in the world, specifically around violence, the Vietnam War. I think I love that song. I think Paul was just really angry at John. And I think in retrospect, probably wishes he didn't maybe make such an attack. Having said that, it was something that he wanted to say. I feel like when I look back at Lennon's music, and it's also interesting to note that in the last year of his life, when Double Fantasy came out, he was no longer singing about politics. He was singing about domesticity, which is interesting because the early 1970 Paul is really about domesticity and life on the farm. The early 70 John Lennon is about revolution, not the song Revolution, but, give peace a chance and some of the instant karma, and woman is, whatever of the world. So it's interesting that in the late 70s, 1980, Lennon decided he was done singing about politics, at least temporarily. But I guess my answer to your question is Paul has every right to take a shot. I love that song, but in retrospect, I don't believe that John Lennon's music suffered from taking any kind of political stand. And I was almost argue, looking back, I think it made him a more compelling artist.
Well, okay. Here's the counter, though, and this could be. I think this is checkmate in a sense. You tell me, but I'll just say one phrase: sometime in New York City.
You're talking about the album itself?
Yeah, that album that blows and is like an embarrassment, universally considered an embarrassment. Are you familiar with that album?
Well, I know the album. I guess my question would be, for purposes of this, I don't know the album well. So, because what happened with my Beatles sort of training is that when I was discovering the Beatles music, I, for Lennon, the way I sort of learned solo Lennon was from a greatest hits album, which was called Shaved Fish.
Yeah.
And so all of the songs that were on Shaved Fish was my kind of entryway into Lennon. So I don't even know if any of the songs from Shaved Fish are on Sometime in New York City. If they are,
No,
I like every song on Shaved Fish.
yeah, no.
So
Sometime in New York City is a lot of like, it's he and Yoko writing. They're almost all political songs. Some of them very specifically tied to events of the day, like, some prisoner they wanted to get released, or there's a song called "The Luck of the Irish," which is sort of his version of what's the Paul song again? The
Give Ireland Back to
Give
the
Ireland
Irish,
Back to the Irish.
which
Oh,
is an awful song.
well,
It's an
I
awful
like it,
song.
but
You
and
like every Paul McCartney song. I mean, that's not surprising. Can I ask you a question? Is woman is the N word of the world. Is that on Sometime in New York City? Because I like that song, and that was on Shaved Fish. But I guess for purposes of this conversation, where you were saying
that is on there.
checkmate.
That is on there.
No,
Yeah.
I thought so. I like that song quite a bit. I think it's a great song. But if the politics got in the way of the music, then it's checkmate. And I don't have enough knowledge to dispute what you're saying.
Like, I'm kind of being facetious in a way. I mean, I think by the time of that album, it was a misstep, and he later more or less admitted that, and it was soon after that that he and Yoko kind of had their break, and I think he was sort of dubious about the John and Yoko connection because that album bombed so horribly. But that said, just like with what we were saying about Paul with vegetarianism and some of his scattered advocacy for different things, I commend John more or less in that time, and I think what he did with Give Peace a Chance and is powerful, and even the idea of war is over if you want it, that whole Billboard situation and the song they wrote around that. And I know we're not here to get like too deep into philosophy per se, but I think that's extremely powerful, in the sense that just to detour for a moment, just, it's easy to think that we solve our problems by throwing money or some kind of infrastructure change of some sort. But I kind of agree with that sentiment that they were coming from, which is, no, really, we got to change our beliefs. We got to change our values in a sense. And if we do that, then the solutions will present themselves, and I think you can trace that historically, across cultures.
Well, I also think we have to look back at what these two in 1970 were they even 30 years old yet?
I don't think Paul was. John might have been.
Okay, so late 20s, early 30s, whatever. Think about how different you were. I think about how different I was. Now we have sons who are not quite there, but approaching those ages. And I think, so let's look at the psychology of the time. So, Paul McCartney, as we talked about many, many times, I think what Paul McCartney felt his job was to be an entertainer. That's what he wanted to be. He was great at it. He's still great at it. And I don't think that he was ever really trying to do anything incredibly deep with
Yeah.
his life or his lyrics. Whereas John, I think, was lost. I think John was angry. And I think John found Yoko, and where Paul found Linda, and they were kind of trying to figure out what are we going to be post Beatles. I think John was like, I'll tell you what I'm going to be post Beatles. I'm going to be a spokesman for peace, and my wife and I are going to do whatever we have to do to bring our fame, bring our currency into the spotlight to try and make the world a better place. And of course, this isn't the tale of John, Paul, and George, but the irony is George was the one who kind of did more than anybody else in terms of putting his money where his mouth is with the concert for Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Which it's also kind of sad that neither John nor Paul participated in the concert for Bangladesh, because if they were really, really trying to help the world, they could have gotten on a private plane and got their asses to Madison Square Garden and sang one song in support of what George was trying to do. So in a way, both guys are flawed, but that's the Dow, right? So I it's not fair, I think, to choose one or the other. I'm not suggesting that's what you're doing. And I think that a lot of this would be really, really fascinating. Every episode we've done, I always think, man, if John had lived, how much of these episodes would be different? I mean, because would John have maintained that domesticity that we saw during Double Fantasy? Would he, if he had gone back to the sometime in New York City, John Lennon, like what would the 50-year-old, 60-year-old, 70-year-old, 80-year-old John Lennon been when it was?
I just read a book called John Lennon 1980, something like the final days in the life, and so it goes through sort of the last part of 79 through all of 1980, and it can only just bring up that question, what if, and I'm sure he would have been involved in Live Aid, and he wasn't the kind of guy that could keep his mouth shut. So I have to imagine he'd be saying a lot of things, but he'd also be changing his mind. It's like even like in the song Revolution, when you're talking about what does he say? Count me in, count me out.
Out in.
It's like so he always had that. But yeah, I know it's such a terrible loss on so many levels. I think we have to mention his Working Class Hero song, because that one, I just think that's a really powerful song, man. Like when I first heard that, I've never heard anything like that. I mean, maybe Dylan's Masters of War is kind of, in that realm, but like, what does he say? You're still fucking peasants to me. He's just, but
as far as I can see.
But if you listen to those words, the way he talks about childhood and how they're, they instill this fear in you, and they sort of beat you up for 12, 18 years, and then they expect you to get in line the way they want you to get in line, and he's exposing that in a direct, very powerful way, that I still say that song stands the test of time.
Well, I agree. I think every song on that album does. And it's interesting when you said that, because it was sort of like that song to me is a little bit of a one song encapsulation of what the Pink Floyd's The Wall is. The Wall is almost like a a bombastic version of Plastic Ono Band between Mother and Working Class Hero and Isolation or whatever. So yeah, no, I agree. I think I don't know if we'd call that politics per se, but it's certainly uh, a song about sort of life in under authority, under, you
Yeah.
know, under any kind of regime, actually. So yeah, I just, my sort of conclusion of this topic, which is maybe in a way the hardest topic to talk about, because of everything we've talked about, I think there's the least amount of material here. But you know, it was important to 1970s John Lennon to be political. And he was, and I think for the most part, perhaps not sometime in New York City, but for the most part, wrote some really, really great political songs. Because you bring up Masters of War, obviously Dylan is noted as the sort of artist that wrote about that stuff and still does. So you know, it wasn't the focal point of the Beatles.
Yeah, no, their thing was peace and love, and you know, I don't know, would you say they in a sense, were they feminist? Did they support you know, sort of women empowerment? I don't know. If we look at their music, I'm saying.
I don't think that their motivation was beyond the peace and love concept. I don't think their motivation was a message. I
Yeah,
think they wrote songs about slices of life, whether it was I Will, or whether it was Mean Mr. Mustard, or songs about Martha, my dear, like about his dog. I think it was just like, we're changing the world based on music and who we are and what we represent. But I don't think that they were going into the studio or writing songs where they were like, this one's going to be about Thatcherism, even though obviously
yeah,
Thatcherism came a lot later. But, you know, although, you know, Taxman, here's George again. Taxman is clearly a
yeah,
shot at the British government. So, but as we talk about John and Paul, even though Paul has written a lot of songs about money, Paul's a surprising amount of songs about money. But that's not politics, that's money. So songs like You Never Give Me Your Money are really not about, you know, politics.
right.
They're about business negotiation.
Well,
So
you know, as I think
I don't
about, yeah, go ahead.
no, so I don't hear or think feminism or politics, or, you know, I just, I think that was not, like when Dylan writes a song like Blowing in the Wind or Masters of War or whatever, he's commenting on what's on the front page of the newspaper. I don't think the Beatles were interested
You
in
know,
that.
as I think about it, as you're talking, I wonder if part of that also is the difference of being an American at that time, like of course Dylan, and being British, because like, you know, we had the whole racial divisions going on, and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all that. They didn't have that over in Britain, as far as I know, and Vietnam, I don't think it was that big of a thing over there. Certainly nowhere near how it was over here. So I think where they really were moved into action was the IRA kind of stuff in, you know, in the early 70s. Um,
I
but
think that's an excellent point, because they also came of age um, just about at the time of the Kennedy assassination. And while I'm sure, I think Europe, I think from everything I've read, the artists that grew up in Britain wanted to come to America and conquer America because it was such a seductive place. But I don't think they were as nearly as affected by some of the things that you're describing. So I think you're right.
yeah, yeah. So, um, so And I think the other thing to say here, or at least question, is, are we all political? Like being silent or staying on the sidelines, that's a political act too, in a sense. So it's there's kind of no way out of it. And yeah, like Paul was in an indirect way making a political statement with all those silly love songs, just sort of saying, yeah, I'm not going to get involved. And of course, if enough people are not involved, well, then we get what we get. So um and then
Yeah,
of
I'm going
course,
to call that a cop out. I'm going to call that a cop out, but I will say this. I
what do you
think
mean
there
a cop out?
is,
What do you mean a cop out?
if everybody would love each other, we wouldn't have any problems. That's sort of like
I'm
easy
not
for you to
saying that.
say.
I'm not
Well,
saying.
I thought that's what you were saying.
No, I'm saying if everybody begs off of getting involved and having their voice heard on issues, then we end up with whatever we end up with.
Yeah, no, I know. That is what I thought you said. But
I'm not copping out. I'm saying
no,
that's
not you cop, not no, I don't think you're copping out. I'm not accusing you of copping out. I'm accusing Paul
on
of
his
copping
part.
out.
Yeah. Well,
Yes,
okay.
but not you. But here's what I would say,
But
and
what do
here's
we
the
expect from
delineation between.
entertainers? I mean, that's the other
Right,
question.
that's what I was going to say. I think that this is really the crux of this conversation. Art, there's sort of a difference in people's minds, right or wrong, between kind of like art and entertainment, art and show business. I think Paul McCartney at his core is an entertainer, and he loves showbiz. And I think Lennon at his core views himself as an artist. And I'm not suggesting Paul isn't an artist, because he's certainly talented enough to be an artist. But I think there's a lot of people that look at art as it has to say something. That painting has to say something. That movie has to say something. That song has to say something. And while I respect that, there's also sort of art as escapism. I just want to be entertained. I want to get away from the reality of the situation. I don't want to be hammered over the head with a message. I want to rock. I want to dance. I want to bop. And I don't think either side is wrong. I don't think the artist necessarily should be credited with so much substance, and the entertainers should be credited with like so little substance. I think there's a real art, pun intended, of being an entertainer without having to always come at something with a message. And I think some of the worst U2 music is the overbearing, politics of what they were trying to do. So I definitely, I hear that. I hear that. I think one of the things that makes our series so interesting to me is the Beatles were so famous and so unique for the time. We're so creative, we're so gifted, that in whatever sort of topic we pick, you kind of expect them to have a point of view.
Right. Like and we expect them to be saviors of some sense, But yeah, I think that's a very good point you make on the art entertainment distinction. And I do think John fashioned himself as an artist, and he looked down on Paul a little bit for his vacuousness or whatever. And he thought, whether he was being political or personal, he thought his was more substantive than Paul's stuff. And look, if look, here's, I mean, the ultimate, right? It's like Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane. Okay, they're both wonderful songs. I have to admit, Strawberry Fields, it's a little bit deeper. It's a little, it's got a little bit more to it.
Well, maybe we could end with this, because I was telling my son that we were going to record an episode, and I don't know if this is really politics. It might be more collaboration, but it could also be politics too, in terms of their attitudes, where I believe, if my son's correct, Paul wrote, "It's getting better all the time," and John wrote, "It can't get no worse."
Can't
So
get much worse. Yeah.
yeah, it can't get much worse. So, that's there you have it.
That may say a lot right there. So, but yeah, as usual, on behalf of them all, peace and love. And we'll see you next time.
Never have any problem with peace and love.
That's right.
See you soon, John.
All right. See you.
Hey.